Give 3 pieces of advice to a new pigeon racer or somebody who just keeps pigeons. What advice would you give them? Your top advice you'd give to somebody new to pigeons.
That was just keeping pigeons.
Just racing pigeons.
If they're gonna race, the first thing I'd do is I'd tell them, go investigate who you have around you, what resources you have around you. Go see the best pigeon flyer, that not a new one, not necessarily the oldest one, because I believe that there are guys that have flown pigeons for 20 years, but they got 1 year's experience 20 times. Go see somebody that is successful. And there are other guys that might not have flown but 10 years, but he may have 5 years experience out of 10 years. But I'd go to the guy that knew what he was doing. Just because he's had them a long time doesn't mean anything. Get the best, and I would determine whether I wanted to fly long distance or short distance. And I'd go to the guy that had the best long distance group of pigeons I could get. And then I'd tell him to look first at conformation, at the first at the breeding, to see what the breeding is. Do they have a history of breeders or flyers, racers in that family? And then I'd select for conformation and that.
You told me a story one time about something about your clock when you were in Wiley.
Oh.
You had a challenge getting it to the club or something to that effect.
We flew with wind-up clocks, and you had to wind them up. They had to be set at a certain time and stopped at a certain time. And if they varied so much, they threw it out. You were out of the race. And they had a very exact set of rules. When you had a lot of people flying, you had to have. There's always somebody going to have some kind of a problem, and you can't just allow exceptions for everything. And I knew that. Anyway, I lived a long way from the clubhouse. I lived over in the next county, and I had to work. They shipped on a Friday night. I had to work late, got off at 5 o'clock, go home. I had to drive a ways to get home, got home, got my birds loaded up, and you had to be there at a certain time to kick those clocks off to start. I just barely got there, and when I got home that day, the county had graded up the road. We lived on a dirt road. The county had graded up the road and was reshaping it, and it came a freak storm, and it was muddy. You couldn't drive in. So there was a farmer there with a tractor, and he carried us in the bucket of his tractor, me and my wife. We got off that afternoon. He carried us into the house, which was about a mile from the road up there. I got my birds, started out with my crates and my clocks. I had to get my wife to help me because I couldn't carry them all, and walk. He wasn't there. So we had to walk that mile up there to where we had to leave our car. And that wasn't a normal situation. It just happened, a freak deal. Got in the car, raced as hard as I could, drove all the way out of Collin County down into Dallas, into downtown Dallas, and the other side of Dallas, and got there just in time for them to set my clock. And I'm begging them to set my clock for me and let me kick it off. I did. We shipped the birds. So we leave to go home, and it's 10 o'clock at night. Get home, I had to walk back in with my clock and my crates. And just as I got in the house, by this time it was after 10 o'clock, about 11 or 12 o'clock, I set my clock up on the mantle, and I looked, and the clock had stopped. And I knew, oh no. And I wanted to fly so bad. And at this time, I don't think I'd ever even won a pigeon race, but I was sure I was going to. So I called, woke the race secretary up. His name was W.B. Durr. He lived in Oak Cliff. I said, Mr. Durr, my clock quit. What can I do? And he said, well, if you can get it to me in the morning by, I don't know what time, 10 o'clock or so. But I had to get it down there and get it reset. He was the race secretary. He'd reset my clock. But I had to do it. I had to drive all the way to Dallas and get it done, get back, walk in, and get home in time before the birds came. So I did. I got up the next morning, walked out, carried the clock to Oak Cliff, got it reset, and walked home, got in. Walked home, got in there, just barely got in time for the race, and I did get in time for the race, and I didn't do diddle. I didn't do nothing on the race, but I felt sure I was going to win it. Anyway, that's probably the most dramatic thing I ever had on the clocks.
That's a good story.
That's a true story, and I've worked so hard. But it's hard for me to understand some of these people now that race a year or two and don't win, or race in small competition, think they got to get it, that they got to have a diploma or something. Like I said, I flew 4.5 years before I won the trophy, and then they didn't give it to me in the combine.
Personally, it starts, well, you have had a love of pigeons since you were a little bitty.
Yeah.
And I was about a teenager when I started. It was the pigeons. I didn't know anything about racing at the time. I just wanted to keep pigeons. If you like the birds, you're drawn to it. Yeah.
And
The other stuff is just secondary. If I never raced again, I'd be okay. Just having pigeons.
well, when I was little, I wanted to race, and I hung around that clubhouse, but I didn't have the money to buy the clock. So I always wanted to race. I love the birds first.
Right.
But to me, it's a lifetime hobby, and I literally learn new things every year. You don't think you do. You think I'm exaggerating, but you learn little nuances about birds and how to motivate them and do things that every year. But it's a whole ecosystem out there, and you control every bit of it. You can literally mold, form, and I'm interested in the genetics and breeding a family of pigeons. I've seen guys come get in and quit because it gets a little difficult and they have to work overtime a little, and they quit, and I'll get back in 2 or 3 years. I was never able to do that. I kept them even when I knew I couldn't win, but I just trained them enough to get them home, but to keep my family going. It's breeding that family of birds, and I like the competition because I want to test them. But I'm not in it for the money of winning the races and all that. I do want to win and try to win. So it's a whole game for me.
So have you still got that line that you had way back when?
I still have birds that trace back to the original Husky and Van Reels that I started in '66 with. That I got from Leon Whitney.
That's what I wish I still had, that line from when I was a kid. That would be so, that's always in the back of my mind. Why didn't I keep my pigeons all those years? Life happened, and it was always in the back of my mind to get back into pigeons as soon as I had the time and it was going to be when I retired regardless. But it gets in your blood.
It is in your blood, and I have a friend, Rick Morris, and he and I have flown since kids, and he couldn't believe that I would leave Dallas. I mean, he wanted to be competition. I love the birds in competition too, but I always wanted to move to East Texas and live in the country down here. And I came. There wasn't even a club here then, but I came, and I was determined to keep my birds. I brought them with me, and it was an ordeal moving them and moving the loft. But I came and brought them, and got a club started, and the competition, I like it, but it's secondary to me. But I have to have, and keeping that family alive. And that's another thing I tell people, a new guy starting, if you're in it for the long haul, you get birds, and you're not going to do any good the first few years you get them. Unless you're just lucky and happen to live in a real good loft location, you might win a race or something. But basically, you're going to have to pay your dues to learn how to fly them and win it. But don't get rid of everything you had just because it didn't. If you got good birds from good bred stuff to start with, don't get rid of them. You keep the very best you had. If you want to go get you some more pigeons every year, that's great. But never get rid of the ones that you started with that came home to you, because they may or may not be. They may be tremendous birds and you're in a bad loft location, or they may not be very good birds, but they know how to home to your area, to your loft and your situation. And I would always go get other birds and try to bring in better birds every year, and still do. But I never get rid of my old family. I'll fly the new ones, and if they do good, I'll cross them on my family. And I'm trying to keep picking up my family and breeding out of my base family pigeons. So.
Well, cool. I don't really have any other questions. Thanks for sitting down and doing this with me.
Yeah, I love the sport, and it's a dying sport, but it's really a fascinating hobby, and I encourage anybody who likes to do it, And I have a lot of respect for people that really have a love for the birds, and I want to mention a couple of people that we had a guy that flew in this club named John Wagner. He wasn't, while he was in this club, he didn't win a lot of races, but he lived in a tremendously bad loft location. They lived up in Arkansas. He literally drove 3 hours one way each week to bring his birds and the other guys' birds from up there down here to fly. And he wasn't in it to just try to win all the races. He tried to win races. He just loved the birds, and he was willing to do that effort. And those are people that I respect, and I have to remember them. The other guy's a guy named Rick Martis. And I learned a lot from Rick, and we grew up together as kids. He loves the birds. And I met people 50 years ago that had pigeons. And I met 1 million of them. Most of them are gone. They're not still flying. But some of those guys, and the guy you know is Tony Jordan. They're guys that love the birds. No matter where they move to, what happens, you meet them 50 years later. If the Lord's let them live and be where they can, they're going to have those pigeons. And there are people it's a crazy hobby, but that love them, and I respect those kind of people. And anybody that likes pigeons is a friend of mine.
I agree. That's you can tell a pigeon man just talking to him for a little bit whether they're in it for the money or they really like pigeons genuinely.
And it's a crazy hobby. I mean, I was in business and people say, "You do what? You raise pigeons?" I don't care who knows it. I raise pigeons.
Yep. You'd be surprised how many people they don't even know that that's a thing. And they have a lot of questions.
Yeah, a lot of people love it. Nowadays, a lot of the young people aren't getting in because they're more into computer games and all that. I've met people all over the world that now, or if we're alive 10 years from now, they'll still have their pigeons and fly.
I do have questions. Tell me about Belgium. What is different from East Texas than Belgium?
Well, let me say Belgium now is not the same as it was when I was there. It's still so much of a pigeon place now compared to here. But the first time I went to Belgium was in 1986. And literally you could look anywhere in town you look, and if it's a pretty day, you'd see pigeons flying.
Huh.
And if you'd watch, it might be even then it might be a half mile away to a guy's house. But every town, there were lots of pigeon flyers. And that way, even at home, when I was a kid growing up, there's pigeons fairly close to you and lots of them. But now, the sport is dying out over there as the older people get out. The young ones aren't coming into it. But in Belgium, it's a big pastime. They, on the radio stations, I don't know if they still do it in Belgium, some of them still do, excuse me. On the radio stations, TV stations, they'll announce the release was from Quivrain this morning. It turned out 55,000 pigeons at 8:05, and winds were that. That's a service. There's enough people do it that it's on the news.
That's crazy.
And literally, I've heard about people who had their pigeons in their attic of their house. I've been in mansions. Their birds are in the house, and not many of them now have it because most of them have more land and they have a pigeon loft out. They call it a garden loft, but. And they flew small numbers of pigeons, and still do. But the commercial end of it now has gotten into it more so than it used to. You have guys that fly, like you hear guys that went into Barcelona, a lot of them are shipping 100 pigeons to the race. They have 300 or 400 pigeons. Before, it was mom and pop operations. And they had a system where they paid per bird to ship. And it was mandatory. Part of that money went to a pool. And let's say they had what we call a Belgian pool that paid a 5-to-1. If it was cost $1 to enter the pool, every 5 birds entered, it paid a place. Like if there's 100 birds in a race and it had a 5-to-1 pool, it'd pay, 4 places, 5, 5 into 12. It'd pay 20%. It'd pay 5 places on 100 birds out of 100 birds. Every 5 birds won a $5 prize. And then it had different levels. It had $1 pools, $2 pools, or whatever. But a lot of those people would win money enough to pay their feed costs at least, or make a little money. When we went there in '86, we went to auctions they were having, and you'd see women over there and kids, a man with his wife and kids, and they'd have 2 birds over there. They're bidding on birds in a race, and they're talking to each other. And what they do, a lot of those guys would buy a few birds to get their breeding stock or whatever, but their wife would take care of the pigeons while they're going to work, and they literally use that as a second income. Some of them, if they were good, they could win a supplemental income to his salary from their proceeds.
Huh.
And then it got more and more money involved, the bigger money, and they still have that same basic type system over there. But there's thousands of pigeons to race, although not as much now as they did. But now when you go to Belgium, you look and you'll see out there, if you'll look, there's an old building out there with vines growing on it. You can tell it had a landing board on it. There was a pigeon flyer. But as he died off, the young ones didn't take it up. When we were there, you go to a guy's loft, the pigeons he had, and this is one reason the Belgian pigeons were better. In America, the guy starts off racing pigeons. He starts with here and here, whatever he can get. He's got a collection of pigeons. He has to race a few years before he even starts to get them weeded down to a family. Those birds, if you go to talk to them, we went to the DeVrent loft, and Rick bought a whole round of birds from the DeVrent brothers when we were there. I believe it was DeVrent. We went in that loft. It had a ladder. You had to climb up into the loft from the barn on it. An old ladder. His daddy flew them, his granddaddy flew them, but they'd just been passed down for generations on those people. So it was just in their culture over there. And now, you don't see that much anymore. A lot of the guys there, their parents flew them still, but they don't go back like generations. And another thing, you could, in downtown streets, you'd look and be a bird flying around, and you'd look and you wouldn't see a loft. But up on the second floor of the building up there, they have tile roofs. You'd see a tile that was kind of stuck out like this in a hole about this big. That was their loft. Their loft was in that attic of that building. And when they won race day, they had to strip that counter mark like we do and put it in a manual clock. They sat in that loft looking at that little hole for that bird to come in. Or they might have somebody outside and holler to them, here's birds. But they sat in that hole and they grabbed that counter mark, stick it in there, put it in there. It was just a different culture. And it's still so much more pigeons than we have here. But the Middle Eastern countries now, Romania and all of those people still have lots of pigeon flyers. But it was a real privilege to get to go to Belgium, and that's something I always dreamed about. And then I've been able to go several times, several times since then, and meet some of those pigeon flyers.